The cannabis community is a diverse set of people from all walks of life, conservative and liberal, black and white, straight and gay, rich and poor, and everyone in between. Learn more about the people we are freeing from adult marijuana prohibition in our Cannabis Community Chat.
Welcome back, everyone. Half past, and today we're going to talk about the grand jury proceeding in Ferguson, Missouri, headed up by prosecutor Bob McColloch, and what a sham travesty of justice this exactly turned out to be. I don't know if you stayed up and watched prosecutor McColloch make his announcement around 8:20 p.m. I guess that was Pacific time, Central Time, 8:20 Central Time. But what I thought at that moment is being echoed by many legal analysts all across this country. And that was that Bob McColloch seemed more like a defense attorney than a prosecuting attorney. Bob McColloch seemed more like the guy who had Darren Wilson as his client, not Mike Brown and his family as his client. Now, this outcome, as it was, all Monday was being prepared to be announced, I told everyone I knew there was no chance in hell there was going to be an indictment. No chance in hell. Now, also, I'll tell you how I believe this would have gone down. Had there been an indictment and Darren Wilson would have had to stand trial, I think he'd have been exonerated. I think he'd have been acquitted. Whether rightfully or not, I think he'd have probably gotten away with it. But the indignity of not even having a trial to determine this is the true sham of justice that took place on Monday. Lisa Bloom is an analyst for NBC and an attorney, and she said, quote, "I suspected that he wasn't cross-examined. Instead, he was just allowed to talk in a narrative and tell a story. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. The prosecutors were treating Wilson like he was their witness, helping them make their case against the accused, Michael Brown. They were not treating him like a suspect or a defendant or even a witness for the other side. They were treating him like one of their own," which of course is exactly what he was. And that is the problem. Going into this, if you're not aware of this, prosecutor Bob McColloch comes from a family of cops. His whole family is cops. His dad was a cop. His grandpa was a cop. Everybody was a cop. McColloch became a prosecutor because there was some reason he couldn't become a cop. He said it was the next best thing. And most tellingly, McColloch's dad, the cop, was killed on a call in the 60s by a black man. Now, I'm not saying that means McColloch couldn't have done a decent job. I'm saying that calls out for him to recuse himself in this situation. And people did. They called on him to recuse himself. They called on Governor Nixon to appoint a special prosecutor, and both of them held the line and said, no, this will be just fine. And from the beginning, this was all about setting up a situation in the grand jury to get Darren Wilson off the hook. Anybody here who's ever been through a grand jury proceeding, anyone listening who's ever had to deal with that, can tell you what a kangaroo court this turned out to be. Now, what the grand jury has generally been for, just legal 101 here, right? A prosecutor is the lawyer for the state. His gig is to make sure the state prosecutes crimes that can't be prosecuted or brought by another party. So in this case, a dead man, Michael Brown. So Bob McColloch's job at that point is to prosecute. His job is to, hey, we've got a killing here. We need to take this to court and solve this. Now, most times people are killed. That's pretty easy to do. There's a death. That's a murder, or could be a murder, or a manslaughter. And that's one of the worst crimes that we prosecute. So you'd think, hey, we want to get those guys. But we don't let prosecutors always just bring every old case to trial. For one, it might clog up the justice system. And for two, there might be an overzealous prosecutor out there. There might be a prosecutor who just has a vendetta, wants to go after someone, has a hunch, but doesn't really have a case. And so that's why we have this grand jury thing. The grand jury thing is so that the prosecutor can say, hey, here's my case. I got this guy. I think he committed a crime. Here's the evidence I have that shows probable cause that he committed this crime. That should be enough for us to go take this to trial. Understand that the standard of proof we're talking about in a grand jury proceeding is probable cause. In a trial, it's beyond reasonable doubt. And that's why I say, had this gone to trial, it's likely, in my mind, that Wilson would have been exonerated because there's some reasonable doubt. But there's certainly probable cause. Probable cause is the hurdle a cop needs to clear to search your car for weed on the side of the road. Cops manufacture probable cause out of thin air. They'll claim they smelled weed just because they saw your long hair or your tattoos or your Pink Floyd bumper sticker or something. Or you're driving a VW bus. Or in that one case we covered the other day, you've got Frisbee disc golf stuff in your car. Cops manufacture probable cause all the time. Probable cause is a low hurdle to clear. But in this situation, the grand jury wasn't used as a tool to affirm that a probable cause existed to prosecute Darren Wilson. It was used to establish enough doubt to exonerate him. See, when you have a grand jury proceeding, one of the things that you don't do is allow the suspect of the proceeding to appear before the grand jury and tell his tale without cross-examination. And within his tale, there are so many examples of misstatements, contradictory. You remember at first, Wilson said he fired his gun once inside the car. Then some evidence came back, a physical evidence came back, said there was 2 shots inside the car, and now it's 2 shots. At one point in Wilson's testimony, he said, Mike Brown had reached across and had complete control of my firearm. 3 or 4 sentences later, he says, well, I wouldn't call it complete control, it was partial control. There's enough inconsistency in there that a first-year law student could have deconstructed this guy, could have cross-examined him to the point that you could establish easy probable cause. Another instance of how this is a kangaroo court. When you have a grand jury, generally what the prosecutor does is says, hey, I've got this suspect. I've got this evidence. And based on that, there's probable cause to indict for manslaughter or murder or whatever it might be. I've got suspect, evidence, and a charge. But that's not what happened in this grand jury. In this grand jury, the prosecutor came up to the grand jury in essence and said, someone was killed. Here's a bunch of evidence and here's the cop. He'll tell you his story. Wow. That's just stunning. Understand here. Let's go back for a second. There was already probable cause to get rid of McColloch. We already told you about his dad being killed by a black man as a cop. Also, let's add to the fact that in 20 years working as a prosecutor, Bob McColloch has never charged a cop in a shooting. And that includes a case where 2 unarmed men were killed after being shot 20 times. And in the last election, McColloch, trying to get reelected, there was some racially charged stuff going on in those elections too. So he's already got no credibility with the very community he is charged with protecting and prosecuting Darren Wilson for assaulting and killing. Typically, a grand jury lasts about a day, maybe a few hours. There's a famous saying that said a prosecutor could get an indictment on a ham sandwich if he wanted to. It's typical. Grand juries are sometimes criticized by defense attorneys as a rubber stamp for the prosecutor. But in this case, I guess it was a rubber stamp. It was the rubber stamp of the thin blue line, that the prosecutors and the cops are all in it together to protect each other. That's what comes across. And when McColloch announced this, he went out of his way to indict everything except Darren Wilson. He indicted the mainstream media. Oh, gee, the mainstream media asked all these questions. They're insatiable. The 24-hour news cycle is just terrible. He indicted Twitter. He indicted the social media for continuing to pry and ask questions. And I believe he did that not because he thought it was upsetting and made it hard for him to make a case to prosecute Darren Wilson, but because it shone a light on this racist institution that was bound to let Darren Wilson walk. I mean, think about this. You got a case of a cop killing an unarmed teenager in cold, just right there in the street, letting his body sit for 4.5 hours. A case that has ignited a national firestorm. And the governor didn't think that deserved a special prosecutor. McColloch didn't think he should recuse himself. And he thought the best way to handle this would not be to have, experts involved, but to allow 12 citizens who have absolutely no schooling on how to cross-examine a witness. Let those 12 citizens decide. He's such a pussy, he couldn't even stick up for what he wanted to do in the case. He punted it to the grand jury so that he could escape any political ramifications from it. I'm telling you, the indignities that black people have suffered in this country, if black folks were the terrible, awful people some folks think they are, this country would have burned down years ago. It's remarkable, the restraint from the black community. We'll talk about that and riots in the Radical Rant.